thank you so much for agreeing to be. We did this before, and you were wonderful, and I forgot to hit record, which is slightly more galling than it usually would have been, because on my very last call before that, the guest reminded me to hit record, so.
Well, then it's all my fault then.
Yes. Okay. So, again, I'm Betty Adams, and I am interviewing Jeffery T. Darlington, who is the creator of the GPF comic strip, among other things. So, just to get this off on the basic footing, tell us about yourself. What's GPF, and how did you wind up making that?
GPF is short for General Protection Fault. It is a comic strip that I've been doing on the internet for almost 22 years. The 22nd anniversary is coming up in just a month here, actually a couple of weeks. It started out as kind of an accidental doodle and a notepad from work, and just kind of spiraled out of control from there. And next thing you know, I'm buying domain names, writing back-end code to update the site automatically, and just doing this same crazy thing over and over again, and no one's told me to stop yet. So.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack there. First off, I was really fascinated. When did you start doodling?
GPF premiered on November 2nd of 1998, and as near as I can estimate, I came up with the initial doodle of the first 5 characters, the main 5 characters, somewhere in the middle of 1997. So a year to, maybe 15 months before the comic premiered on the web is when I started coming up with the ideas, and then laying down some of the initial groundwork and writing some of the initial stories.
Okay. Did you have any background, any education in drawing at this point?
No, not really. Just art classes here and there, mostly in junior high and high school. When I was a little kid, I remember watching on public television. I used to love the Secret City show. That was all about trying to instill a love of art in kids, and it was very cartoony, but it did go over a lot of the fundamentals of art. And I remember my back in junior high, one of my teachers told me, "Don't draw any of that Secret City stuff." So, so I had to unlearn a few things that I learned there, but then kind of built upon that. So nothing formal in that regard.
Okay. So tell me again about the time that you really got started. What were you doing in life then that you just started doodling?
Well, I had just recently graduated from college, and I had started working for IBM, of all places, and I was working on a customer site. And when I first started there, they didn't really have a whole lot for me to do yet. Just basically, hey, here's your cube, here's your PC, here's a bunch of books for you to read. Read all these boring, dry books about software methodology and IBM culture. And I said, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. And so until I waited for them to give me something to do, I had some time to kill. So I sat down and did what I normally did. I pulled out a pad of paper and a pencil or pen and started doodling. And next thing I knew, one day I had these 5 weird looking characters on this piece of paper, and I started coming up with names for them and then stories to go along with them.
Tell us about these characters, please. Because now I gotta say my favorite is Fuker. So why don't you start there?
Well, Fuker, he's definitely a character. So I find that a lot of times there are certain archetypes of characters that I do kind of gravitate toward, and Fuker is one of them. Just the weird oddball that if something strange has got to happen, it usually happens to him. And in many ways, he's an archetype of the uber geek, the hardcore Linux guy who suffers a bit from a loss, operating system elitism. So much so that his friends have to give him an intervention, and it almost cost him a relationship.
I followed that entire arc,
Uh-huh.
and I kind of know what operating elite system is because I run in those circles. But for the audience who might not know what on earth you're talking about, what does it mean when someone suffers from operating system elite syndrome?
Assuming that their chosen operating system, whether it's Windows, Mac, Linux, or what have you, is better than anything else out there, and everybody else can just, format their hard drive because they're not going to get any better.
Okay, so now I'm a biologist, so I've only ever been on the periphery of this. I use what works best at the moment. Sometimes that's two sticks I'm rubbing together in the middle of the forest. So, but it does seem to me that really reached a peak in the early aughts, and it's kind of not necessarily cooled down, but it's found its own niche, and it kind of stays in its own corner these days. Mm-hmm. Is that your observation?
It depends. There is a good bit of it still out there. It's just I know I don't necessarily run in those particular circles, and I've always subscribed to the old hacker's axiom of all hardware sucks, all software sucks, and whatever is best is what sucks the least for you. So, I run Windows here on the machine I'm talking to you now. That's the one I do the comics on, but then all my servers run Linux because I feel that that's better for that purpose for the servers. So, just what works best for you is what's best.
Back to Fuker.
Yes.
What was he inspired by one person in particular, or just a bunch of people, or was he more of a concept?
He's more of a concept, although I did cherry pick certain personality traits from some of my close friends, and I've had several of them pull me aside and say confidentially, "I'm Fuker, aren't I? Aren't I? You can admit it to me." And I have to say, no, technically, thinking you're God's gift to women, maybe, but no.
Okay, so tell us about the others. Is Fuker's best friend?
Fuker's best friend, and technically the star of the show, is Nick, who is the main character, and he was based somewhat on myself to start with, although he's kind of diverged and gone into his own direction. And his love interest and eventual wife, Key, who was also based loosely on my wife. Following from that, we have Dwayne, the go get 'em, we can do it manager type, who's always enthusiastic, but he's always the straight man and rarely participates in the wackier adventures. And of course, everyone's favorite evil marketing chick, Trudy Trueheart. Sometimes the villain, sometimes the repentant lost soul. Arguably the most complex character in the entire series by a long shot.
Okay, so we've kind of introduced our characters, and tell us about their environment. For the most part, it's a long series. They've had a lot of different adventures. Just what's their home planet, as it were?
Under normal circumstances, they can normally be found in the halls of GPF Software, a small software company. They don't do a whole lot of business. They do enough to to be profitable, but have a few server racks and special ISP agreements to keep them afloat. But they usually...
Again, let's put a pin in that thought. What's an ISP agreement?
Internet service provider. So being a software company writing custom software and often hosting servers to provide access to that, they probably have a number of agreements with their internet service provider to make sure that they've got a nice fat pipe, big enough tube to stuff all the bits down. So
you've got your cast of characters. You've nested them comfortably in a very mundane modern day situation, and then you send them on wacky adventures. So tell me about how some of that has evolved over time, because back at the beginning it was pretty kind of, Dilbert type stuff, things that could conceivably happen within an office. Currently they're hopping realities in an alien spaceship, so something changed there.
Yeah, it's I'd like to think of it as just kind of an evolution of, not only my personal interests, but just stories kind of flowed over time. And some of it was laying the groundwork, because being able to put these characters in a mundane, ordinary environment grounds them in reality, so that when I started adding some of the crazier and weirder things that either I knew were coming, or just kind of popped into my head and said, oh, this would be neat. Having that groundwork just kind of gives you a starting point to see how they would react in a normal circumstance. And then as things have gotten zanier and more bizarre, they can just kind of look around and shrug and say, oh, okay, so we're on an alien spaceship now and we're going into alternate realities.
Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about your art. You have a kind of distinctive, I never know whether to call it a 3-finger style or a 4-finger style, because you got to figure out whether or not to count the thumb. But your style is not overly realistic, but nothing crazy when it comes to just drawing humans and basic animals. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the style was intentionally designed to be simplistic, mostly for speed and efficiency. I grew up reading comics in the newspaper back when they actually printed newspapers, and I remember reading, Garfield and Dilbert and the Phantom and whatever else was in the paper at the time. And I did notice that in a lot of the simpler strips, Peanuts and such, the art style was specifically constrained to try and get the most emotion and impact out of the minimum number of lines. And part of that was just because, a lot of times an artist draws really, really, really big, and then it ends up getting shrunk very tiny when it's actually printed on the page. So you kind of have to have some efficiency in being able to express that with the minimal possible. And I knew that I was working a 9-to-5 job, and I had this idea for a comic strip that at the time I was going to do it 6 days a week. So I had to be able to do it quickly and in my spare time, because I wasn't going to take a day off to do it, and I certainly wasn't sure I was going to make enough money off of it to quit the day job and work on that full time. So going with that kind of mindset, I decided to make the characters as simplistic as possible. Although over time, I've increased the level of detail. If you look really, really careful, you can see even with the main characters with their very simple faces, their bodies are way more complex than they used to be, with more detail.
Yeah, joint articulation and stuff like that. You can see the joints in the knuckles and such. Okay, so you've set them in this realistic world, then you start just adding weirdness. And the first one that pops to mind is Fluker's roommate. So who isn't Nick, but tell us about Fuker's roommate.
Fuker's roommate, yes. Fred, the sentient slime mold. He kind of started out, back around that time when I was doing it. The trend seemed to be that you had your cast of characters who are usually normal humans, and you always had the one strange, bizarre, non-human sidekick. So Sluggy Freelance had Bun Bun the Mini Lop, and User Friendly had the Dust Puppy. So I thought, well, I might as well have something along those lines. And I thought, well, what if Fuker's apartment was so squalid that the mold in the back of the fridge gained sentience? And it just kind of snowballed from there. Next thing you know, he's paying half the rent, and he's sustaining this by being an online literature professor.
Okay, there's a question I had for you. The online literature professor thing didn't come up till way after you introduced Fred. Was that something you knew about him going in, or was that something you logicked out from the situation later?
It was a logicked out from the situation. I made the joke about very early on, about even before he even had a name. The joke was added that this green blob of goo was paying half the rent, and eventually, I don't remember if people were asking questions or if I had come up with this independently, but I had to reason out, well, how is he paying the rent? What kind of job could he have that would bring in the money, but then no one would know that he was a slime mold? And I thought, well, it'd have to be something online. And being educated mostly by watching PBS on television, I've kind of figured, well, maybe he's into literature and fine arts and such. So it just kind of snowballed from there.
So, yeah, that leads me kind of to my next question. Making him a literature professor, was that you establishing Fred as having a particularly high intelligence, or was that you kind of backhanding a literary analysis?
Well, maybe a little bit of both, because all of the jokes that Fred made about Tess of the D'Urbervilles are my own opinions. I hated that book, but it was more of his intelligence. I wanted him to feel educated, but maybe in a way not as geeky as everyone else. So I wanted
touch of elegance.
Yes, he definitely is intelligent, and I wanted to have a touch of elegance for such a mundane creature. But I didn't want him to be yet another computer geek. So putting him in a literature role just kind of felt more natural.
Okay, and I just want to make a comment. You spoke of a trend of having an unusual non-human companion in a group, and just not to contradict you, but in my observation, that's more of a human constant, because every branch of the military, every organization has a mascot. For myself, it's the national park. We have the white bison. It's a bit more complicated. The legend is more complicated, but it's a magical creature. So there is a human tendency where you have a bunch of different human people coming together who don't have a very strongly coherent shared culture. They tend to reach out for the nearest comfortable thing and kind of latch on to it. And this often takes the shape of most military units in World War I and World War II had some sort of animal mascot. And so I think that might be a bit more of a underlying vein of humanity than a casual trend. But
actually, I'm glad you went down that road, because mascot was the word I was thinking of, but it wasn't coming to mind. So.
Okay, so then tell me about how you got this website started, because this was back in the day before there were handy websites to build websites with, is what I used. So you actually had to do some work to get your comic up.
Yeah, I went uh, a little bit beforehand. I started thinking, well, I knew, again, I'm working a day job. I don't have time to do everything manually, and I knew at the time a few cartoonists who were posting their comics by literally hand changing HTML and uploading the updated files. And I said, no, I can't do that. There's no way I can do that. I don't have time to do that. So I did spend some time, you know, developing some JavaScript and some server-side code. Um, Bought the domain name, found what seemed at the time to be a decent hosting company, and just started uploading the files and putting the automation scripts in there to make it do everything auto-magically. So all I had to do technically was upload my files into the right directory and it would do the work for me. So, and yeah, you're right. This was before there were, I mean, the closest you could get to automating things was to fire up, what was it, Netscape Navigator Gold that had the built-in HTML editor. And you could do that kind of WYSIWYG as close as you could get at the time, I think.
Yeah, my first computer experience was my school had some old Commodores somebody had donated, the green screens, and you had to code if you wanted to play games. And we didn't realize we were being basically carrot and sticked into learning how to do basic coding. They had like 3 games on it, but it was fun. So, you've got a lot of you've been building this comic for decades now. You've got a lot of mythology in the comic. Tell me about how you build that mythology. It has some commonalities with most comic mythologies, of course, but it's not really a cookie cutter like you get with some webcomics. Your mythology has a distinct flavor to it in this universe you've created. So, where does that come from?
Well, it actually kind of comes from even before GPF started, because I've literally drawn comics almost my entire life. I remember creating little comics even back in grade school that I would doodle on the back of homework and things like that. And some of it just kind of organically evolved over time of having these different disparate characters that were in each kind of had their own universe in which they operated, and that universe had its own set of rules, whether I was aware of that yet or not. And before too long I started thinking of, well, I really kind of like to be able to have this character and this character get together and have adventures. And I don't really see how that would work, because, you know, this universe over here is full of anthropomorphic characters, you know, cats and mice and rabbits and stuff. And over here, you know, these are all humans, but maybe they're superhumans with superpowers. So how would I get them together? And so I started taking that and weaving it together to make a multiverse and trying to find the rules that would govern how the two different, you know, how each universe worked independently, but then how they were interconnected in one way or another. And while I didn't necessarily intend to go that route, maybe at the very start of GPF, it did kind of quickly occur to me that, you know, this would be a way to bring in some of that old legacy stuff if I use GPF to lay the groundwork and kind of build that in very slowly over time and introduce some of these other characters and their universes as well.
Okay, so let's talk about some of your more eccentric characters. And I just forgot all their names. The girl with randomness, not random. The one who helps out the big guy in the in-between space.
Oh, Mischief.
Mischief, yes.
Yes, the gamester in Mischief.
Okay, yeah.
Well, they kind of started. The Gamester came first, and he was kind of a trickster type character, probably more in line with that you might think of as like Q from Star Trek: The Next Generation, although maybe a little wackier in the beginning. And then somewhere over time, he started evolving, and I kind of slotted him into this role of the system administrator of the universe, of the cosmos, who, whether he likes it or not, he's the one who has to keep all these strange things working smoothly. So whenever when everything is normal, the universes go about doing their own things, but then you start having characters that are building time machines or building interdimensional transports that can take people from one universe to another, and it just kind of makes a big mess for him. So that would kind of evolved to be his role, and I kind of saw him going into that role reluctantly, like it was given to him as a punishment for something that he did. And to make matters worse, he was given an apprentice, a female extra-dimensional entity by the name of Mischief. And of course, these entities tend to live up to their names. So Mischief is indeed quite mischievous, and being assigned to the Gamester as his protege, if you will, was in part punishment for both of them, because she was getting into trouble and needed to be reined in, while the Gamester was still getting things dumped on him from on high, whoever that may be, as punishment for whatever he did before.
Okay, so this is kind of circling back quite a ways, but I forgot to ask it when we were talking about Fred. Are we going to see any more of the poetic talking bear?
Wallace T. Bruin.
Yes.
That's a good question. I've always enjoyed bringing him back, but sometimes coming up with good ways to bring him back can be a little bit difficult. So I will never say it's not possible. So, but at this point in time, I don't have any immediate plans. Right now, things are a little crazy as it stands with our heroes trying to find the missing planet Earth. So Wallace would be trapped on this Earth along with everyone else. So maybe they'll run into him if they find the Earth. Maybe we'll take a little bit longer before we see him again.
Okay, now, not to spill any specific tea, but he was introduced in one of my favorite story arcs. And the setup being that this Dwayne he wants to do a team building exercise, so he takes all of his crew out into the forest to go camping. And I just kind of wondered, was that a pulled from life experience for you? Because it seemed a little realistic, and it seemed to like touch on that universal theme of humanity that really only gets touched on when you're adding some personal salt to the mix.
Oh no, I can't say that one was inspired by real life. Not too much. Growing up, I was a Boy Scout, and I did enjoy going out in camping in the woods and doing all kinds of interesting things, learning about wildlife and stuff. And so I tried to pull in some of my personal experience in that regard, but the story itself is more of a parody of all the trust building type things that you often see in management courses. Everyone has done the trust fall, where one person gets up on a table and crosses their arms and leans back and off the table, and the other people have to catch them, but they're not there, and so the person falls on the ground. So that was a joke that's been done so many times, I wanted to avoid it. So I thought it would be interesting if, Dwayne likes camping. Maybe we could get the whole gang out there, and since they're computer geeks, they won't know what to do with themselves. Nick, being a Boy Scout, a former Boy Scout, he would know what he would be doing. But, Fugger and Key and Trudy, they wouldn't know what to do with themselves in the woods at all. So that just kind of seemed like one of those, throw the gang into this situation and let hilarity ensue and take care of itself.